Armageddon and the Mind of War. Fundamentalism, Apocalypse, and the Unborn Mind. Preamble. In periods of uncertainty and upheaval, the human imagination has repeatedly turned toward visions of a final battle. Across centuries and cultures, prophets, theologians, and political movements have proclaimed that history is moving toward a climactic confrontation between the forces of good and evil, a cosmic war that will end the present world and usher in a new one. In the Christian tradition, this final conflict is often called Armageddon, a word drawn from the Book of Revelation that has come to symbolize the ultimate battlefield of history. Yet the power of Armageddon does not lie merely in ancient scripture. It persists because it speaks directly to something within the human mind itself. When societies experience fear, instability, or perceived existential threat, apocalyptic narratives rise once again. These narratives offer a simple and emotionally compelling framework. The world is divided into the righteous and the wicked, the saved and the damned, the chosen and the enemy. Within this framework, conflict is no longer tragic. It becomes necessary, even sacred. War is interpreted not as human failure, but as the unfolding of divine destiny. Throughout history, such ideas have repeatedly inspired movements that believe themselves to be participating in the final drama of the cosmos. In some cases, these beliefs remain symbolic or devotional. In others, they shaped real political decisions, influenced wars, and justified violence carried out in the name of ultimate truth. When the conviction arises that destruction itself fulfills a divine plan, the danger becomes profound, particularly in an age where the means of destruction extend to the scale of the entire planet. This series does not approach the subject of Armageddon as a matter of political argument or theological dispute. Instead, it asks a deeper question. What kind of mind produces visions of a final war? What psychological and spiritual structures give rise to the belief that the world must end in a catastrophic battle between absolute forces? From the perspective of Unborn Mind Zen, the answer lies in the nature of dualistic consciousness itself. The mind that perceives reality through rigid divisions, self and other, believer and infidel, the saved and the condemned, naturally imagines history in the same terms. Once reality is divided into opposing camps, conflict becomes inevitable, and the imagination easily projects that conflict onto the largest possible stage, the end of the world itself. The teaching of the unborn mind points in a radically different direction. The unborn is not a participant in cosmic warfare, nor does it stand on one side of history against another. It is the groundless ground of awareness prior to all division. When this reality is recognized, the imagined battlefield of final conflict dissolves. The war between ultimate good and ultimate evil is revealed not as a destiny written into the structure of the universe, but as a projection arising within the divided mind. In this light, Armageddon becomes less a prophecy about the future than a mirror reflecting the present condition of human consciousness. The battle it describes is the drama of a mind that has not yet recognized its own source. The true resolution of this conflict is not achieved through victory over an enemy, but through the awakening that ends the illusion of separation itself. The chapters that follow, therefore, explore Armageddon from several perspectives: its historical origins, the psychology of fundamentalism, the recurring appearance of apocalyptic movements throughout history, and the ways such beliefs can influence modern geopolitical realities. Yet at every stage, the deeper inquiry remains the same: to understand the mind that imagines the final war and to reveal the freedom that appears when that mind is seen through. The true end of the world, from the standpoint of awakening, is not the destruction of the earth. It is the end of the world constructed by division, fear, and absolute certainty. When the unborn is recognized, the battlefield disappears, and what remains is the luminous immediacy of reality as it has always been prior to prophecy, prior to ideology, and prior to the mind of war. Chapter 1. The Myth of Armageddon. The word Armageddon has entered the modern imagination as a synonym for the end of the world. It evokes images of catastrophic war, collapsing civilizations, fire descending from the heavens, and the final battle between good and evil. Yet, the term itself originates from a far more specific source, a single phrase found in the final book of the Christian New Testament. In the book of Revelation, the forces opposed to God gather for a climactic confrontation at a place called Har-Megiddo, usually translated as Armageddon. The word refers to the ancient city of Megiddo in northern Israel, a strategic location that witnessed numerous battles throughout the history of the Near East. Because of its position overlooking key trade routes and military corridors, Megiddo became a symbol of decisive conflict. Armies met there repeatedly across centuries, and the site acquired a reputation as a place where history itself seemed to pivot. When the author of Revelation employed the name, however, he was not describing a literal battlefield where modern armies would someday assemble. The entire book is written in the symbolic language of Jewish apocalyptic literature, a form of writing that flourished during periods of persecution and political turmoil. In these texts, cosmic imagery, visionary symbolism, and mythic drama were used to express hope that oppressive powers would ultimately be overturned and justice restored. Within this symbolic framework, Armageddon represented the culmination of a cosmic struggle between the forces aligned with divine order and those associated with corruption and tyranny. The imagery is vivid and deliberately overwhelming: beasts rising from the sea, heavenly armies, trumpets announcing catastrophe, and the final defeat of evil. Yet the language of Revelation belongs to a literary tradition that communicates through symbol rather than literal prediction. It speaks in the language of myth, vision, and allegory. Over time, however, many readers began interpreting these images as precise forecasts of future historical events. The symbolic battlefield became a literal one. The mythic drama was recast as a timetable of coming disasters. As this literal interpretation took hold, Armageddon gradually transformed from a symbolic narrative about the struggle between justice and oppression into a prophecy of a real-world war that would mark the end of human history. This shift from symbol to literal expectation marks a crucial turning point. Once Armageddon is understood as an event that must physically occur, the idea begins to exert powerful psychological influence. The world becomes divided into opposing camps, each imagined to be playing its role in the approaching cosmic conflict. Political struggles, cultural tensions, and military confrontations are reinterpreted as signs that the final battle is drawing near. The danger of this interpretation is not merely theological, it is psychological. When people become convinced that history must culminate in catastrophic war, conflict itself can begin to appear meaningful or even necessary. War becomes woven into a sacred narrative. Instead of being viewed as a tragedy to be avoided, it can be interpreted as the fulfillment of divine destiny. Throughout history, this expectation has repeatedly surfaced during periods of crisis. Social upheaval, political instability, and widespread fear often generate renewed interest in apocalyptic prophecy. In such moments, the human mind seeks certainty in a world that feels unstable. The idea of a final battle offers a strangely reassuring explanation. The chaos of the present is not meaningless. It is simply the prelude to the end. Yet, from the perspective of Unborn Mind Zen, the fascination with Armageddon reveals something profound about the structure of the human mind itself. The mind that imagines a final war is a mind that already perceives reality through division. It divides the world into opposing forces, into absolute good and absolute evil, into those who belong and those who must be defeated. Once this dualistic structure is in place, the idea of an ultimate confrontation becomes almost inevitable. In this sense, Armageddon is not primarily a prophecy about the future. It is a reflection of a particular way of seeing the world. It mirrors the mind that cannot conceive of resolution except through victory over an enemy. The teaching of the unborn mind reveals a radically different possibility. The unborn does not arise within the battlefield of opposing forces. It is prior to every division the mind creates. From the standpoint of the unborn, the entire drama of cosmic warfare appears as a projection of dualistic consciousness. The battlefield exists only within the mind that insists upon enemies. When this is recognized, the meaning of Armageddon changes entirely. It is no longer the final war at the end of time. Instead, it becomes a symbolic expression of the divided mind itself, a mind that cannot yet see beyond its own oppositions. The deeper inquiry, therefore, is not whether Armageddon will occur in the future. The deeper inquiry is whether the mind that imagines Armageddon can awaken from the vision of conflict it has created. For when the unborn is recognized, the battlefield disappears, the armies dissolve. The war that seemed destined to end the world is revealed to have been a dream arising within the mind of division itself. And with that recognition, the myth of Armageddon loses its power. For the true end of the world is not a catastrophic war at the end of history. It is the end of the divided mind that imagined such a war in the first place. Chapter 2. The Psychology of Fundamentalism. Religious traditions have long attempted to answer the deepest questions of human existence: the origin of the world, the nature of suffering, the meaning of life, and the possibility of liberation or salvation. In their most profound expressions, these traditions invite humility, compassion, and a recognition that ultimate reality cannot be fully captured by concepts. Yet within the history of religion, there also appears another tendency, one that moves in the opposite direction. This tendency seeks certainty rather than inquiry, rigid boundaries rather than open exploration. It is this psychological movement that gives rise to what is commonly called fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is not defined simply by religious devotion. Many deeply religious people remain open, reflective, and compassionate toward differing views. Rather, fundamentalism emerges when a belief system becomes inseparable from identity itself. When this occurs, questioning the belief begins to feel like an attack on the person who holds it. Ideas are no longer examined, they must be defended. What began as spiritual teaching gradually hardens into ideological certainty. At the psychological level, fundamentalism often arises from the human desire for stability in a world that appears unpredictable and fragile. History repeatedly shows that fundamentalist movements grow during times of rapid social change, cultural uncertainty, or perceived moral decline. When familiar structures seem to be dissolving, the mind naturally searches for firm ground. Absolute interpretations of sacred texts can appear to provide that ground. Literalism becomes the key mechanism through which this stability is maintained. Symbolic narratives that were originally meant to communicate spiritual insight become interpreted as precise, historical, or prophetic statements. Metaphor becomes fact. Visionary imagery becomes prediction. The interpretive flexibility that once allowed religious traditions to adapt across centuries becomes replaced by rigid certainty. Once this shift occurs, the world begins to divide into sharply defined categories: the faithful and the unbelievers, the righteous and the corrupt, the chosen and the condemned. This division provides psychological comfort because it simplifies the complexity of reality. Moral ambiguity disappears. The universe becomes morally ordered, with each person clearly located on one side or the other. Yet this same process also generates a powerful dynamic of conflict. When identity is defined through belief, disagreement easily becomes hostility. Those who question the doctrine may be perceived not merely as mistaken, but as dangerous. The preservation of truth appears to require resistance against opposing forces. In this way, the psychological structure of fundamentalism naturally produces enemies. Apocalyptic narratives often emerge within this environment because they provide a dramatic resolution to the tensions created by such divisions. If the world is perceived as increasingly hostile to one sacred truth, the expectation of a final cosmic battle can seem not only plausible but inevitable. The prophecy of Armageddon becomes psychologically satisfying because it promises that the struggle will ultimately be resolved through divine intervention. In this sense, fundamentalism does not merely interpret apocalyptic prophecy, it psychologically prepares the ground for it. The mind that organizes reality into absolute camps is already imagining the conditions under which a final confrontation must occur. History becomes the stage upon which the drama of cosmic conflict will eventually unfold. From the perspective of Unborn Mind Zen, however, this entire structure arises from a deeper misunderstanding about the nature of mind itself. Fundamentalism depends upon the assumption that truth exists as a fixed conceptual structure that must be defended, yet the unborn mind cannot be captured by any concept or doctrine. It is not contained within scriptures, philosophies, or belief systems, no matter how sacred they may appear. When this is recognized, the psychological tension that fuels fundamentalism begins to dissolve. The need to defend an absolute conceptual framework falls away because reality itself is no longer confined to conceptual boundaries. The unborn is not threatened by differing interpretations, nor does it require the defeat of opposing views. It simply is prior to all divisions created by thought. The divided mind seeks security through certainty. It believes that survival depends upon defending its worldview against challenge. But the awakening pointed to in Zen reveals something entirely different: the groundless freedom of awareness itself, which does not need to protect any identity or ideology. From this perspective, fundamentalism can be understood not as the preservation of faith, but as the mind's attempt to protect itself from uncertainty. The fear of groundlessness produces rigid belief. The fear of ambiguity produces absolute doctrine, and the fear of losing one's identity produces the imagined necessity of defending truth through conflict. In this way, the psychology of fundamentalism reveals the deeper roots of the mind of war. The battlefield does not begin with armies or weapons. It begins with a mind that has divided the world into opposing camps and concluded that one side must ultimately prevail. The teaching of the unborn mind invites a different recognition altogether. When the groundless nature of awareness is realized, the need to divide reality into absolute oppositions disappears. Without such division, the imagined necessity of final conflict dissolves as well. The mind that awakens to the unborn no longer sees a world moving inevitably toward Armageddon. Instead, it sees the vast unfolding of reality free from the compulsions of ideological struggle. And with that recognition, the psychological machinery that fuels fundamentalism begins to fall silent. Chapter 3: Apocalyptic Movements Through History. The expectation that history is moving toward a final cataclysmic confrontation has appeared repeatedly across civilizations. While the specific imagery may differ: fire from heaven, divine armies, cosmic purification, or the collapse of corrupt empires, the underlying pattern is remarkably consistent. During periods of crisis, groups arise that become convinced the present age is nearing its end and that they themselves are living in the final chapter of human history. Apocalyptic thinking did not originate with the Book of Revelation. Long before the emergence of Christianity, Jewish apocalyptic literature had already developed a symbolic language describing the eventual defeat of oppressive powers and the restoration of divine justice. Texts such as the Book of Daniel, written during the turmoil of the 2nd century BCE, employed vivid visions of beasts, heavenly courts, and cosmic upheaval to communicate the hope that unjust rulers would not reign forever. These writings emerged during times when political domination and persecution seemed overwhelming. Under such circumstances, apocalyptic imagery offered reassurance. History was not meaningless chaos, but part of a larger divine drama moving toward eventual resolution. The language of cosmic conflict allowed oppressed communities to imagine that the forces dominating them would ultimately be judged and overturned. When Christianity arose within this environment, apocalyptic expectation was already deeply embedded in the religious imagination. Early Christian communities lived under the shadow of Roman power. and many believed that divine intervention would soon bring an end to the empire's authority. The Book of Revelation itself reflects this historical context, portraying imperial domination through symbolic figures such as the beast and the whore of Babylon. As centuries passed, however, the Roman Empire itself became Christian, and the anticipated end of the world did not arrive. Yet the apocalyptic imagination did not disappear. Instead, it adapted to new historical conditions. Movements periodically arose claiming that the final age had begun, that hidden prophecies were being fulfilled, and that the faithful must prepare for the imminent transformation of the world. Throughout the Middle Ages, numerous prophetic movements proclaimed that the end of history was approaching. Some interpreted natural disasters, wars, or plagues as signs that divine judgment was near. Others believed that a chosen leader or spiritual figure would soon appear to inaugurate a purified age. These movements often attracted followers during times when social and political instability left many people searching for meaning and certainty. In some cases, apocalyptic expectation inspired intense religious devotion and moral reform. In other cases, it produced dramatic upheaval. Communities convinced they were living in the final days sometimes withdrew from society altogether, while others sought to actively bring about the conditions described in prophetic texts. The pattern continued into the modern era. The upheavals of the Reformation, the wars of religion in Europe, and later revolutionary movements frequently revived apocalyptic interpretations of history. Each generation discovered new ways of interpreting ancient prophecies in light of contemporary events. Political rivals were cast as agents of evil, while military conflicts were interpreted as signs that the final confrontation was drawing closer. In the 20th and 21st centuries, apocalyptic expectations have taken new forms. Technological warfare, nuclear weapons, and global geopolitical tensions have given renewed plausibility to visions of worldwide catastrophe. For many believers, modern conflicts appear to align with ancient prophetic narratives. Political developments in the Middle East, in particular, are often interpreted through the lens of biblical prophecy, reinforcing the belief that history is approaching its climactic moment. What remains striking across these centuries is how consistently human communities place themselves at the center of the supposed final drama. Each generation reads its own anxieties and conflicts into the symbolic language of apocalypse. The expectation of the end becomes a mirror reflecting the fears and hopes of the present moment. From the standpoint of Unborn Mind Zen, this recurring pattern reveals something fundamental about the nature of the conceptual mind. The mind naturally seeks narrative structure. It prefers stories with beginnings, climaxes, and conclusions. Faced with the immense complexity of history, the mind simplifies events into dramatic arcs that seem to move toward decisive resolution. Apocalyptic narratives provide one of the most powerful forms of such storytelling. They transform the uncertainty of historical change into a clear narrative of cosmic struggle that will ultimately culminate in final victory. In doing so, they offer psychological clarity in a world that often appears ambiguous and unpredictable. Yet this clarity comes at a cost. When history is interpreted as an inevitable march toward ultimate confrontation, the present moment becomes overshadowed by the expectation of future catastrophe. Human conflicts are no longer seen simply as tragic outcomes of ignorance and fear. They become steps in a divinely scripted drama. The teaching of the unborn mind invites us to look beyond this narrative structure entirely. The unborn does not move through history toward a predetermined conclusion. It is not a character within the drama of cosmic warfare. It is the groundless reality within which all historical narratives arise and dissolve. From this perspective, the repeated emergence of apocalyptic movements does not reveal the unfolding of prophecy. Rather, it reveals the enduring tendency of the human mind to project its own divisions onto the structure of the universe. The battlefield of Armageddon appears again and again in the imagination, because the divided mind continually recreates it. Each generation rediscovers the same symbolic conflict, and assumes it belongs uniquely to its own moment in history. But when the nature of mind itself is recognized, the pattern becomes clear. The drama of final conflict is not the destiny of the world. It is the recurring projection of a mind that has not yet awakened to the freedom of the unborn. And when that recognition dawns, the fascination with apocalyptic destiny gradually fades. History is no longer a stage moving toward cosmic war. It becomes simply the ever-changing display of phenomena arising within the boundless field of awareness itself. Chapter 4. The Machinery of Apocalyptic Belief. Throughout history, apocalyptic expectation has rarely arisen spontaneously. It is not simply the product of individuals reading sacred texts and independently arriving at the conclusion that the end of the world is near. Rather, it tends to emerge through systems of interpretation, communities of reinforcement, and institutions that gradually transform symbolic language into literal expectation. When such systems mature, they begin to function as what may be called the machinery of apocalyptic belief. This machinery operates through several mutually reinforcing elements. First, there is scriptural absolutism. Sacred texts that originally spoke through symbol, metaphor, and visionary imagery become treated as precise historical forecasts. The poetic landscapes of prophetic literature, mountains trembling, stars falling, armies gathering, are interpreted not as spiritual drama, but as literal geopolitical prediction. In this process, ambiguity disappears. What was once contemplative literature becomes a timetable. Second, there emerges a class of interpreters who claim privileged insight into these texts. These interpreters, whether clergy, charismatic leaders, or popular authors, construct elaborate prophetic frameworks. Complex charts are drawn. Historical events are mapped onto scriptural passages. Wars, natural disasters, and political conflicts are woven into narratives that seem to confirm the approaching end. Because the human mind is deeply inclined to detect patterns, each new crisis appears to validate the system. The machinery begins to run on its own momentum. Third, community reinforcement strengthens the belief. When individuals gather within groups that share apocalyptic expectations, doubt gradually becomes difficult to express. The social environment rewards those who affirm the narrative and marginalizes those who question it. Over time, the belief ceases to be merely theological. It becomes part of personal identity and collective belonging. Fourth, and perhaps most dangerous, the machinery introduces a subtle but powerful psychological shift. Catastrophe becomes desirable. If one believes that a final cosmic battle will usher in divine victory, then the conditions that lead to such a battle can begin to appear not as tragedies to be prevented, but as signs to be welcomed. In this way, apocalyptic belief can quietly invert moral instinct. War is no longer purely evil. It becomes a stage upon which sacred destiny unfolds. Peace may even appear suspicious, as though it delays the fulfillment of prophecy. History offers many examples of such dynamics. Movements expecting imminent divine intervention have periodically withdrawn from society, abandoned ordinary responsibilities, or predicted specific dates for the end of the world. Yet when the machinery merges with political power or ideological conflict, its consequences can become far more severe. At that point, belief no longer remains within the private sphere of religion. It begins to influence real-world policy, public rhetoric, and geopolitical imagination. When this occurs, the ancient language of prophecy becomes intertwined with modern weapons, national identities, and global tensions. The symbolic battlefield of sacred text risks being projected onto the literal battlefield of nations. From the perspective of the unborn mind, such developments reveal the deep confusion that arises when conceptual mind mistakes its own projections for ultimate truth. Apocalyptic certainty emerges from a mind that has become captivated by its own narratives. It forgets the luminous openness from which all appearances arise, and instead clings to rigid images of destiny. The unborn neither predicts catastrophe nor seeks salvation through destruction. It remains prior to both hope and fear, prior to victory and defeat. From that ground, the machinery of apocalyptic belief can be seen clearly as what it is: a structure constructed by thought, sustained by fear, and animated by the human longing for ultimate meaning. Yet understanding the machinery does not automatically dismantle it. Once such belief becomes embedded in culture, politics, and identity, it acquires enormous momentum. Entire generations may grow up within its interpretive framework, seeing world events through its lens. To step outside that lens requires a deeper transformation of mind itself. It requires awakening from the narratives of cosmic conflict into the immediacy of direct seeing. Only there can the roots of war begin to dissolve. Chapter 5. When prophecy meets power. Apocalyptic belief becomes most dangerous when it leaves the realm of speculation and enters the corridors of power. Throughout history, prophetic visions have not remained confined to monasteries, pulpits, or sacred texts. At crucial moments, they have influenced rulers, generals, and political movements. When prophecy meets power, the consequences can reshape nations and ignite wars. Religious ideas have always interacted with political authority. Kings have sought divine legitimacy, and religious leaders have often advised rulers. Yet apocalyptic belief introduces a unique dynamic into this relationship. If one truly believes that history is approaching a final cosmic confrontation between good and evil, then political conflict may appear as the instrument through which that confrontation unfolds. In such circumstances, diplomacy may seem less meaningful than destiny. This mindset can subtly influence political thinking. Policies that increase tension or escalate conflict may be interpreted not as failures of leadership, but as signs that prophecy is advancing. The unfolding of crisis begins to confirm a narrative already believed to be inevitable. When this occurs, the machinery described in the previous chapter begins to accelerate. History offers numerous examples of leaders and movements interpreting contemporary events through apocalyptic frameworks. During periods of religious revival, charismatic figures have proclaimed that their generation stood on the threshold of the final battle foretold in sacred scripture. These declarations have sometimes inspired intense missionary activity, social reform, or spiritual renewal. But at other times, they have also fueled hostility toward perceived enemies who are cast as agents of ultimate evil. Once a political adversary becomes identified with apocalyptic symbolism Antichrist, the forces of darkness, or the enemies of God compromise, becomes nearly impossible. Negotiation with such an adversary appears morally suspect, even dangerous. The conflict becomes absolute. Modern geopolitics has not escaped this pattern. In several regions of the world, political narratives have merged with religious prophecy in ways that frame international conflict as part of a divine timetable. Leaders may not always publicly acknowledge such beliefs, yet they circulate widely within popular religious culture and influence the expectations of millions. When large populations believe that war in a particular region will trigger the fulfillment of sacred prophecy, that belief can exert powerful pressure on political discourse. It can shape public opinion, influence voting blocs, and embolden movements that seek to align political action with perceived divine destiny. At that point, the boundary between theology and geopolitics begins to dissolve. From the perspective of the unborn mind, this fusion reveals the profound danger of mistaking conceptual narratives for ultimate truth. The mind that clings to prophetic certainty becomes unable to see the living complexity of the present moment. It interprets events not as they are, but as confirmations of a pre-existing story. The unborn mind, however, does not operate through narratives of cosmic struggle. It does not divide the world into absolute camps of final good and final evil. It sees that such divisions arise within thought itself. When awareness returns to the ground of the unborn, the urgency of prophetic drama begins to loosen. One sees that history does not move toward a single climactic confrontation ordained in advance. Rather, History unfolds through the collective actions of human beings, shaped by their fears, hopes, beliefs, and misunderstandings. In that light, the true battlefield of Armageddon is not a geographical valley, nor a final military conflict among nations. It is the human mind itself. When prophecy meets power without wisdom, the result can be catastrophic. But when awareness penetrates the narratives that fuel conflict, a different possibility appears. The machinery of war loses its sacred justification, and the mind begins to awaken from the dream of inevitable destruction. Chapter 6. The Myth of the Final Battle. Few ideas have exerted as powerful a hold upon the human imagination as the expectation of a final, decisive battle between the forces of good and evil. Across cultures and religious traditions, one finds some version of this vision, a climactic confrontation in which history reaches its ultimate turning point and the destiny of the world is decided. In the Christian tradition, this expectation takes the form of Armageddon, the prophesied battle described in the Book of Revelation. In other traditions, similar images appear: cosmic wars between divine and demonic forces, the final triumph of righteousness over darkness, the end of one age and the birth of another. These visions have inspired devotion, courage, and moral seriousness, yet they have also nourished fear and a dangerous fascination with catastrophe. At the heart of these narratives lies a profound psychological pattern. Human beings tend to interpret their struggles through the language of conflict. The mind instinctively divides experience into opposing forces: light and darkness, truth and error, salvation and destruction. When these divisions become magnified and projected onto the entire cosmos, they give rise to the myth of the final battle. In this myth, history itself becomes a battlefield. Yet when one examines these narratives carefully, an important question arises. What if the final battle is not a literal event awaiting humanity in the future, but a symbolic drama describing the struggle within the human mind? From the perspective of contemplative traditions, many of the great apocalyptic texts can be read not as geopolitical predictions, but as visionary descriptions of the inner transformation of consciousness. The monstrous figures and cosmic upheavals that populate these texts represent the collapse of deeply rooted patterns of fear, attachment, and ignorance. In this interpretation, Armageddon does not occur in a valley in the Middle East or on the fields of global warfare. It unfolds in the hidden terrain of awareness itself. The forces of darkness symbolize the structures of delusion that bind the mind: hatred, greed, fanaticism, and the craving for absolute certainty. The forces of light represent the awakening of clarity, compassion, and wisdom. The battle between them is not fought with armies, but with insight. Seen in this way, the myth of the final battle reveals an unexpected truth. The enemy humanity fears most is not an external power, but the confusion generated by its own mind. The unborn mind points directly to this realization. The unborn is not engaged in any cosmic war. It does not oppose darkness with violence or seek victory over imagined enemies. It simply reveals that the entire drama of opposition arises within conceptual thought. When awareness rests in the unborn, the apparent battlefield dissolves. This does not mean that conflict disappears from the world overnight. Human societies will continue to experience tension, disagreement, and even violence. Yet the belief that history must culminate in a divinely ordained apocalypse begins to lose its hold. One sees that the expectation of a final war is itself a projection of the divided mind. The myth of the final battle, therefore, contains a hidden paradox. It warns humanity about the destructive potential of evil, yet when misunderstood, it can actually encourage the very violence it seeks to overcome. Those who believe they are participating in a sacred war may feel justified in actions that perpetuate suffering. But when the myth is understood symbolically rather than literally, its meaning changes entirely. The final battle becomes an invitation to examine the roots of conflict within one's own consciousness. The true Armageddon is the moment when awareness confronts the illusions that sustain fear and division. And when those illusions fall away, the battlefield itself disappears. The victory foretold by the myth is not the destruction of enemies, but the awakening of the mind that no longer needs them. Chapter 7. The True End of the World. For centuries, humanity has imagined the end of the world as a catastrophic event unfolding somewhere in the future. A final war, cosmic destruction, divine judgment, or the collapse of civilization. These visions have been painted in fire and thunder, described in sacred texts, and preached from countless pulpits. They evoke fear, awe, and a sense that history itself is rushing toward a decisive conclusion. Yet the deeper one examines these visions, the more a profound possibility emerges. The true end of the world may not be the destruction of the planet or the collapse of human civilization. The true end of the world is the end of the world created by the divided mind. Human beings do not simply inhabit a physical world of mountains, oceans, and stars. They also inhabit a psychological world constructed from beliefs, fears, identities, and narratives. This inner world divides reality into opposing camps: friend and enemy, sacred and profane, chosen and condemned. It is this world of division that gives rise to the myth of ultimate conflict. In that constructed world, Armageddon appears inevitable. But the unborn mind reveals something radically different. The unborn is prior to all conceptual divisions. It is not bound by the narratives through which the human mind interprets reality. It does not participate in the dramas of victory and defeat that dominate historical imagination. From the perspective of the unborn, the world of absolute conflict is already an illusion. This does not mean that suffering and violence are unreal. Wars occur. People suffer. Nations struggle with fear and power. But the belief that reality itself is divided into opposing cosmic forces is a projection of the conceptual mind. It is the mind attempting to impose its dualistic framework upon the entire universe. When that framework collapses, something remarkable occurs. The imagined battlefield disappears. The end of the world, in this deeper sense, is the moment when the mind awakens from the illusion that it inhabits a universe defined by ultimate opposition. The end of the world is the end of the narrative that history must culminate in a final, divinely sanctioned war. It is the end of the story that humanity has been telling itself for millennia. In the light of the unborn mind, Armageddon ceases to be a prophecy of destruction. It becomes a symbolic mirror reflecting the human tendency to project inner conflict onto the stage of history. The terrifying imagery of apocalypse reveals not the destiny of the cosmos, but the intensity of the mind's own divisions. When those divisions dissolve, the world does not end in flames. It simply appears as it has always been, a vast and luminous unfolding in which conflict and harmony arise within a deeper field that remains untouched. This is why the unborn mind cannot participate in apocalyptic expectation. The unborn neither fears the end of the world nor longs for it. It recognizes that what truly ends is the illusion that the world was ever divided in the first place. In this sense, awakening is the true apocalypse, not the destruction of the earth, but the revelation of what has always been present beneath the stories humanity has told itself. The end of the world is therefore not a future catastrophe waiting to arrive. It is the moment when the mind finally awakens from the dream of Armageddon. And in that awakening, what remains is not destruction, but clarity, not judgment, but compassion, not the end of the world, but the recognition of the unborn that was never threatened by it. Concluding teaching. Awakening from the dream of Armageddon. Humanity has long lived beneath the shadow of its own prophecies. Across centuries, visions of final judgment, cosmic war, and the destruction of the world have shaped religious imagination and political expectation. These visions have inspired both devotion and fear. They have called people to repentance and vigilance, yet they have also nurtured a deep fascination with catastrophe. The series you have just explored has examined this phenomenon from several perspectives: historical, psychological, political, and contemplative. We have seen how apocalyptic narratives emerge, how they gain power within communities, and how they can influence the decisions of individuals and nations. We have seen how the expectation of a final battle can become embedded in the very machinery of belief. But the most important insight lies beyond analysis. The true significance of Armageddon is not found in speculation about future events. It lies in what these visions reveal about the human mind itself. The mind seeks certainty in a world of uncertainty. Faced with suffering, conflict, and the apparent chaos of history, it constructs narratives that promise ultimate resolution. The idea of a final battle between good and evil provides a powerful sense of meaning. It assures believers that history is moving toward a decisive victory of righteousness. Yet this same narrative also reinforces the divisions that give rise to conflict in the first place. When human beings divide the world into absolute camps of light and darkness, they inevitably project those divisions onto other people. Entire communities, cultures, and nations can be cast as embodiments of evil. Under such conditions, hostility becomes justified, and violence can appear sanctified. Thus, the myth of Armageddon can unintentionally perpetuate the very suffering it claims to resolve. The teaching of the unborn mind offers a radically different perspective. The unborn does not interpret reality through the lens of cosmic opposition. It does not divide existence into final enemies and final allies. Instead, it reveals that the apparent divisions of the world arise within conceptual thought. They are constructions of the mind, sustained by belief and reinforced by fear. When awareness returns to the ground of the unborn, something extraordinary becomes visible. The battlefield disappears, not because conflict magically vanishes from human life, but because the mind no longer projects its inner divisions onto the structure of reality itself. The world is no longer interpreted as a stage upon which ultimate enemies must be defeated. It is simply the unfolding display of phenomena arising within the vast openness of awareness. In this openness, compassion naturally emerges. When the illusion of absolute opposition dissolves, the suffering of others can no longer be dismissed as the fate of enemies or adversaries. It is recognized as part of the shared condition of human existence. This recognition changes everything. The expectation of Armageddon begins to lose its power. One sees that the true transformation humanity requires does not come through catastrophic events imposed from outside. It arises through the awakening of the mind itself. The real apocalypse is the collapse of ignorance. The real revelation is the discovery that the unborn mind has never been threatened by the conflicts of history. And the true victory foretold in so many religious traditions is not the destruction of enemies, but the awakening of wisdom and compassion within the human heart. In this light, the ancient visions of apocalypse reveal their deepest meaning. They are not predictions of the end of the world. They are invitations to awaken from the dream that the world was ever divided.